So I wanted to show again MASH, and then in this instance, just show how I'd like to use it in the scene that I'm working on right now. So this is this Victorian scene that I've got, and the geometry I'm using from Kitbash 3D. And right now this is basically what the render is for what I've got laid in. But what I want to do is in this center area, I want to consider it kind of to be a park. So I want to use MASH and Redshift proxy for a tree and just populate in here and then try and see what I like. So let's change the ground shader. So this is just going to be something short term. So let me just make another Lambert. And let me just call this park area. And then I'm just going to give it a green coloring. And then now select the geo, assign it, and then now we'll have the green, do a quick render. And then now you can see, it extends out here as well, but the main area I want is this area right here. So what I want to do now is I'm going to bring in my tree proxy. So I'll go Redshift, proxy, create. So here it is on the bottom. So what I want to do, there's the Redshift proxy, it's a placeholder, so then you need to find the file that I've already created, and I did this in the last MASH tutorial as I basically set up this tree as a proxy. So let's see, there's the one I created. So now it's brought in this proxy. Now if I go to the perspective window, you can see right there, it's coming in as a cube. And then you can preview the mesh. So here you can see it. But what you're also noticing is the scale of it compared to what I want. Looks like it's quite big. But let me just look at where the pivot point is, because what you want is the pivot point to be right at your ground level. So that seems to be okay. So I've got my tree. Well, let me just do a quick render. So here's a render of the tree, so that's rendering fine. And what you can see as well, let me select, go back to the proxy. You can kind of see how many faces are on that piece of geo. It's almost like 1.3 million. Right there, faces. So it's quite dense, but what you'll see is since it's coming in as a proxy, it's an instance. And once we use it in MASH, it's going to be instance in there as well. So I have my proxy selected. I want to change either to animation, so you can see MASH show up, or effects, and MASH shows up again. So you want to create a MASH network. You want to make sure it's set to instance. And then we'll change the distribution type in a second. So now you can see if we orbit, it comes in with that standard distribute node, and it's at a distance of 20, so that you got 20 tree, well, a space of 60 units per tree. There's only 4. But what we want to do is we want to derive it from a map. So we'll go to mesh. And then basically what we want to do is we want to go back to that ground and select it to the MASH network. So here's the MASH network. And to distribute, so here's the input mesh. So you want to middle mouse drag the ground, and now the MASH network is deriving from this. And it's quite large. So you can see here if I do 10, we're still trying to see, there you go. You'll see a few trees here and there. So my ground plane, or ground that I have in here, is infinitely wider than what I want. So there's two ways. I mean, you can see how I spread things out like systematically in here. So there's two ways. I could just make a new plane that just covers this area, and that might be a little bit more efficient. Or what I can do is I can derive the texture of the ground for where I want this to basically populate, which is pretty much just in this area. So I duplicated the ground plane, and what I did is I scaled it down so it's just in the park area that we want. So what we'll do is we'll go back to our mesh network, and instead of the ground shape, I'm going to drag this park in there. There we go. So now what you're seeing is the network is actually picking up exactly where this ground plane is. Let me do a quick render. So now you can see here's the tree showing up in the render. So now it's basically trying to figure out if we want the scale of the trees a little bit smaller, and then really how many trees and how dense do we want this. So the easiest thing is we can up the number of trees really quickly. And you can see here, look at the larger canopy. We can do a quick render. So you can see a much denser park. But what you're noticing is the same tree is just being repeated in the same placement. So what we want to do is we want to add a random node. So if you go to our mesh network, add a random. There we go. And then the random will add a positional data. So we want to zero that out. What we want is we want the trees to rotate in a random 360 fashion. And then maybe a uniform scale of maybe 0.25. And then now let's see what we get. So this is what we had. There. Now that's starting to fill in and just have that little bit of interest. But now it's a little bit thick. So maybe what I might want to do is come back on the distribution, and then I can hand place the trees that I want a little bit more selectively with a placer node. So let's go back to the distribute, maybe lower it where it's like 50. There, that's a little better. Now you can always change, like I got it down to 50 and you see what we have for trees here. You can change the seed, so the randomization of everything, and see what you like. So here you can see that. There's a little bit more placement. And maybe I feel the trees maybe are already too big. So I could always go back to our original Redshift proxy and scale that down. So just scale that down. There we go. And you can see they're all scaling down because they're directly linked to that. And then go back, and then yeah, maybe that's starting to feel a little better. But even with that, what we can do is we can go to our mesh network and add a placer node. So the placer node is above everything, so I'm going to drag it below. So here's our placer. And I'm just going to have it where I can draw and add points as I want. So this is great because you can just hand pick where you want these nodes, these trees that you're starting to hand pick. You know, maybe they're just lining the courtyard a little bit more. Maybe there's another one there. And it's adhering to the geometry. And what I like about this is the part that I find for MASH it's very, influential, is this is a complete layering system. So we can turn off the random, the placer itself, keep the placer on, turn off our distribute. So now all we have are the placer trees. So it really can be really dynamic. Let's see what that renders. So here we go. And that's starting to feel a little bit more. And now what we want to do is we'll add grass and maybe some other like low shrubs. But this is where, MASH for me really is useful, because you can kind of go in and just do a main scattering of the elements that you want first, and then you can do these hand-picked elements, and then you can always change and delete and move and rotate these individual pieces as well. So everything is editable in MASH, which is great.